Paul to the church in such place, a praise of their virtues, then an address of the issues that were besetting them at the time that they either wrote about or which were, I'm skipping in and out. And then there are closing words, so know that. So I don't know about you, but I always thought that the books of the Bible were a series of thou shalt and thou shalt not. And when I found out it was more the telling of stories than anything else, I got very, very disillusioned. And it was hard for me to make that adjustment. So even the Pauline letters, if you're looking for, tell me how to live the Christian faith, you got to wade through the opening address, the praise of their virtues, and the closing words before you can find out that little tiny section that's the meat. Galatia and Corinth, those three epistles are probably written around the year 55, probably. The epistle to the church in Galatia, it's not a town, it's an area of Turkey, of modern-day Turkey. So note that. This is to a province, probably the only epistle that's written to a province, other than what are called the Catholic epistles, but the only Pauline epistle written to a province. And I'm proud to say that it was a Celtic area, probably settled by Celtic mercenaries who were given land grants in like the 3rd century BC. So that may explain a lot of their behavior too. We'll see. In any case, it's written to an area, not to a specified church. So don't go looking in your Bible encyclopedias and dictionaries for Galatia. There's no such place. It's a province. It's an area. And the main emphasis of the epistle is that the Judaizing issue is becoming a factor between Judaism and Christianity. Remember, Christianity is a sect of Judaism at this time and understood that, and the Jewish people are persecuting it. But they began to misunderstand what the Christians were saying. By allowing the Gentiles into the church, many in the Jewish community began to think that we were saying the law didn't matter. We abrogate the law. That is wrong. We do not abrogate the law. Read Romans, which we will look at the next time. I think it's the next time. So in any case, they were addressing the Judaizing issue. That's what it was called. This whole struggle is called the Judaizing issue. And Galatians is the first epistle to deal with it. So Christianity, one of the basic things points it makes, and all of these epistles make these points, that all these epistles that deal with this issue, that we are not abrogating the law. So we are not saying that the law is not good, and it's not valid. We are not saying that. We are just initiating or introducing an old point that's always been held to be true, that the starting point of Judaism is not the law, but faith in God. So that's the key. Christianity is not abrogate the law. Read that. Read Galatians. Read Romans. Read the epistle of St. James the Just. And we'll look at that the next time. And I told you I was going to give you a handout showing how they use almost the same language, except St. James is much more succinct than St. Paul was. So, in any case, Christianity fulfills the law and points beyond it. And this is an important thing for us to see. We have to see beyond what's given to us. It's more than that. If we don't get this point, we don't get the point of even Christianity. It's seeing beyond. When we look at the Gospels, we're going to see each one of them has that message. There's more here than what meets the eye. There's more here than the practice that meets the eye. So, and it refers, when it does point beyond, if we point beyond, it will refer to creation and its fulfillment or its completion. So you have the beginning, the very beginning, and the beginning was God created the heavens and the earth, and then you have the end, the last two chapters, the first two chapters of Genesis and the last two chapters of Revelation, the antiphons of the Bible, both referring to creation and recreation. That's a key ingredient for helping us understand. God wants to recreate us in the image that he intended for us to be in the beginning. That's what this life is all about. So when we are not participating with God or cooperating with God in the recreation of our own beings, we are failing miserably. And that's the accusation against Judaism. They'd stopped with the law of Moses, begun and ended with the law of Moses as if that were an end in itself. That concept today is what we would call religion. And we need to be purged of religion. So that's what all this is about. So in Galatians, does the law transform us? No, only the grace of God transforms us. Doesn't mean, again, that the law is not good. It's just that we have a different starting point. And the Galatians, as many of these books will do, references earlier concepts of the covenant, such as the Noahic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant. So it's not just the Mosaic expression of the covenant. It's all of that. Anyone can be saved. Anyone can enter into the process of this relationship. Any of us. So I had a friend years ago. He lived a notorious life, and we met years later. And he was asking me, and this was after my conversion experience, and I remember we had this conversation. I was explaining what had happened to me, and he looked at me and he said, "It's too late for me." And I felt so sad because I thought it's never too late for any of us, no matter how bad we've been. St. Peter denied Christ 3 times. St. Paul murdered Christians or participated in their murders. Now, how do you get any worse than that? And yet, one is the saint to the Gentiles, the other is the patron saint of Jews. Wow. So in any case, Galatians also offers us something, a sin list. And we have several sin lists in the New Testament. And so it's another proof that we cannot settle for the law is abrogated. It doesn't matter what we do. That is not what it says. Not with the sin list. Look here, folks. These are the things we are going to discover about ourselves and about reality. And his sin lists are found in chapter 5, verses 19 to 21. And it's broken into 2 categories, I think. The first one is basic sins that we discover in coming to Christianity. Adultery, fornication, what uncleanness means, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, and contentions. The deeper ones are jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambition, dissensions, heresies, envy, murder, or even character murder. So when we slander people or gossip about them, we're committing character murder. We don't know that, but we are. Drunkenness and revelries. Those are the deeper forms. And then there's a virtues list. We can do these without following the Mosaic covenant. Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And the Galatians epistle also uses the word anathema for the first time in the New Testament period that we see. Later councils will say, if people don't believe in who Christ is or who we say Christ is, let them be anathema. And we look at that and we think, oh, these mean, nasty, ugly people for early centuries of the church's life. Well, St. Paul said it. So it's in the New Testament. The anathema is the Greek version of the Hebrew word cherem, which means a condemnation of something. Something is set apart and it's designated as being other than, for other use. It belongs to God and we are not to touch it. So the anathema is used for the first time. It is the church saying no. It's a modern American notion that we should never say no to anybody. You're judging me. No, we're not. We're not judging anybody. We're just saying no. There is right and there is wrong. And that's all there is to it. If we don't like that, we don't have to be Orthodox. None of us is, nobody's being twisted with an arm behind his back. You're going to be Orthodox. By God, it's the last thing I do. That's not the way it is. We can say no. We don't have to buy into this. So that's what anathema says. And chapter 2, verse 10 may refer to the Noahide covenant. So those are the basic things that come out of Galatians. This is in the 1st century, the middle of the 1st century. Corinth. There's an old saying in Christianity that if you're looking for the perfect church and you find it, don't join it because it will immediately not be perfect anymore. Because we're not perfect. But, well, I'm only a human, we say. Yeah, well, to be only human is to be above these things. This is to be, I'm only fallen humanity. So the church in Corinth was a church with issues, and the first epistle is written to deal with the issues. This group was a mess. They were probably partly Jewish Christian and primarily Gentile Christians, so they had no clue about anything. So what we read about it was the contentions in the parish. If you listen to me, then I'll show you what the real way to salvation is. He can't show you anything. Or he may say, don't listen to Rooney, he's lost. Well, I am. So anyway, we have contentions in the parish and this kind of stuff. I remember years ago when a priest had a priest under him, a young guy fresh out of seminary, who thought he knew everything. And I was lucky when I came out of seminary, my priest warned me about this kind of situation, but he didn't get warned. So the people were suggesting to him, if you just took charge, we know this would be a better place. So he led an insurrection and he lost. And the priest crucified him. And I'm surprised his ministry continued on. But we just don't play that game. Contentions in the parish is what the Corinthians, one of the things they suffered from. I'm baptized by Paul and I'm more spiritual than you are. You're baptized by Apollos and you're baptized by whoever. St. Paul said, I'm sure glad I didn't baptize many of you. So the misunderstanding of wisdom. What is wisdom? Well, we think of it in secular terms, the wisdom of the world. I'm really smart. I have college degrees, and all that kind of stuff. Well, if you remember wisdom, I don't have a blackboard, so I can't write it down, but there are three things of wisdom, three definitions of wisdom. One is God's self-revelation. And that's one we want. God reveals himself. Because we can't understand God as God unless he reveals himself. And he knows our inability to understand. So it has to be that way. Number two, we may use human logic, but we measure it by what God has revealed. And if our logic doesn't measure up, then we reject our logic, not God's revelation. In today's society, what people say is, well, science says, and therefore I reject what the faith says. Wrong. The third type is that, and we actually use both of those first two together, but with emphasis on what God has revealed about himself. So all of reality, there's a whole world of reality out there that's spiritual and immaterial, starting with God. And how are we going to understand that? We're fleshly people. We are fallen fleshly people, material. That's the way we think. That's the way we see reality. But there's a whole world out there that's parallel to us, if you will, if we can use that language. So it's parallel to us. It's real. Just because we don't see it doesn't mean it's not real, but why can't we see it? Why don't we have the eyes to see? That's part of what the Christian faith is about. And the third level of wisdom is dropping that whole notion of measuring it by God's revelation of himself and just taking human logic. What does my logic say? Folks, I saw a video recently, I think I've told you about this, where it was about the science and the creation. And I remember that when I was young, we were taught that there was the solar system and the universe. Well, in this particular video, it kept going out. Now, this has been 50 years later, or 60 years later, so science has progressed considerably. And they not only looked at the solar system and the universe, but the space beyond the universe. And suddenly the solar system and the Earth, you couldn't even see Earth anymore. And it was a temptation to get to the end of it all, where the video was showing, and to conclude, well, God can't exist because this is the mind working, and it says this is it. This is what we've got for now. I remember it's said that one of the first Russian cosmonauts went up into space and said, God can't exist because I don't see him up here. Well, that's the way we are. God can't exist because my logic doesn't allow for it. That's the third form of wisdom, and that's the one the Corinthians had. And St. Paul wants us to see the first two. Misunderstanding of stewardship. We think stewardship has to do with money, right? No, that's only one aspect of it. Everything is stewardship. Everything we do in the Christian life is a matter of stewardship. I don't want to go into that now. Sexual immorality. They had no idea what that was about. The law knew. Jewish Christians knew what it was about. Lack of discernment. I had no clue what discernment was. Not everything is from God. Just because somebody feels good about it doesn't mean it's godly or that it's even good. Marriage. What is marriage? What does our society say today? It's a legal contract between two persons, right? Gender is irrelevant, right? Wrong. And according to the church, it's between a man and a woman. And one of the reasons why, and I don't want to go into this, I'm going to look at this when we look at antinomy farther down the road. One of the reasons is there's nothing more different from us than our opposite sex. We don't have to enter into marriage, but if we do, it needs to be with somebody who's the opposite gender so that that person can then become a complement to us and force us to look at ourselves from a entirely different perspective and to change. One of you was looking at wedding rings earlier, and I was looking at mine. Ours used to have nice Florentine on them when we got them 45 years ago. And they've been worn down since then, and there's more symbolism in that than you know. And you're looking at it right here. This guy's been worn down. So it comes with the turf. I told you women get together and they go, men, and they shake their heads, and they all shake their heads. So you know how we are. So marriage, virginity. Oh, that's terrible in our society. Widowhood. We don't understand that. And yet there was a ministry in the early church of the widows. And they had a function. It was absorbed into the monastic tradition, the female monastic tradition. Love, and we're going to come back to this in a later lesson. Chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, the love chapter, which in many non-Orthodox churches is used as one of the lessons at marriage. Love, because love in the society is be nice. The first two things that St. Paul mentions, love is patient and kind. Be patient, be kind. But read the rest of it, whatever else it says, and list them. A whole lot of different things besides being patient and kind. I'm not denigrating those, but they're only two of many. The Corinthians didn't get this. Worship. What is worship? Well, the things that he points out were order, structure. He pointed out that he uses the word anamnesis, remembrance. And so many of American Christian groups say that remembrance means to remember. Wrong. There's no Hebrew word for remembrance. There's a concept, but not a word. So they had to come up with something, and the closest thing they had was in Greek, anamnesis, which means to make manifest in the present something which occurred in the past or another point in time. Anamnesis. Do this in anamnesis of me. Make it present. That's what worship is. We are making it present. That's not some game that he made up or I made up or we made up. It's not something the church made up and we're too staid to do anything about it. It's the way it is. This is worship. It is the body and blood of Christ. And you know, a lot of people question this, and you want to ask the question, what about the word is don't we understand? It is. We don't have to understand how, we never will. And that's been the struggle through the ages for many people who have deviated from the church's teaching. That is, how can it be? I don't know how it can be. It just is. It just is. Unworthy reception. The early church believed, and St. Paul believed this, that if we didn't believe correctly about what the Eucharist was, we could bring judgment upon ourselves. Well, we don't want to hear that. Well, that doesn't mean don't come up for communion, by the way. We're all unworthy when we come up for communion. Each of us. Everybody's unworthy. So don't wait till we're worthy. That's pride. And that's another thing I'm going to look at in the future. So unworthy reception can cause health issues. In the 2nd century, St. Cyprian wrote a treatise on people who came to communion improperly prepared and who suffered and even died from receiving wrongly. And you read that and you go, oh, these people are crazy and obsessive and they're fanatics. Well, really? Read 1 Corinthians. Hence, we have closed communion in the Orthodox Church. And I don't know about you, but that's what really bothered me when I first came in. Closed communion? How can you do this to me? I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus. I have a right. I have a right to receive. Oh, really? I have a right to receive? I don't have a right. The church is trying to protect us, and it's the only way it knows how is to judge by certain things, certain basic things. Resurrection in chapter 15. I've already talked about this last time. We need to understand what the terms of the resurrection. We don't let our society, even the Christian society, tell us what the resurrection is. We go by what the church teaches, what has been handed down to us, what has been delivered to us. And hence almsgiving, that's related to stewardship. There's a corner up here on Bryant Urban where a lot of the transients hang out, people begging for alms. And there was a sign up there one day that said, it was a city sign that said, you do not have to give to these people. You do not have to give to these people. St. Clement of Alexandria said, let your alms sweat in your hands. Hang on to them long enough to discern. What I would say to you is that if you're worried about that and you're feeling guilty and you want to deal with your guilt, keep a track of the amount and give to a charity that you know. Years ago, within the last 10 years, there was an article when we lived in McKinney on a group who hung out on a street corner in Dallas and begged alms. And one of them was in a wheelchair, and they were all acting like they were all separate and individual. And it turned out it was like a ring, and that was their job. And the guy got up from the wheelchair and folded it up and put it in the back of his car, and they all drove off. So we can't let that stop us from almsgiving. That's one of the things we need to understand about almsgiving. But there are ways to deal with this if we're worried about that. So 1 Corinthians was written to address those issues. Those issues. And the church in Corinth didn't quite get it, because in the 90s AD, Clement of Rome, St. Clement of Rome, wrote an epistle to them because they were still dealing with the authority in the church, and they were trying to get rid of the existing priests in order to bring somebody else in who was more to their liking, more spiritual. So they hadn't gotten some things in all those years. So, in summary then, the 2 Corinthians was written primarily with St. Paul's mention of trying to show with what authority he speaks these things. And he constantly is bringing up the issue of his authority. What renders him capable of saying this? There's a number of reasons. I don't want to go into all that. Sometimes you may not even be sure he's doing that, but that's all right. That's what he's doing. I always was troubled by you are, we are, and you are. And I was thinking, what? And so really what he was showing how the Corinthians, the mindset was that, well, we've arrived. Hallelujah. We're real spiritual. I mean, I'm wearing a cassock and I'm a priest, so I'm real spiritual, right? So, right, Father? Notice how quickly he said that.
The cassock hides our shame.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it does. I ought to remember that one. The cassock hides our shame. It's true. And all of you who wear cassocks, just remember that. It hides our shame. So in any case, it took them decades to get it. So in summary then, the first mention of Judaism Judaizing occurs between 55 and 57, or 54 and 57. And that was the demand that one join the covenant by virtue of the Mosaic covenant, and that's the only one had to keep. and surrender to the Palestinian Jewish interpretation of the Torah, which is refuted in Matthew's gospel. There are the first references to the Noahide and Abrahamic covenants. And we'll see this when we get to Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews, because the writer of the Hebrews points to Christ not having a genealogy which the priesthood demanded, and it talks about the Abrahamic covenant. Christ is the great high priest by virtue of the Abrahamic covenant. So it's a different starting point. It's not that the law is not correct, it's just a different starting point. This is where I start. Secondly, third, sin has deeper implications. Whatever we discover about our sins, they're more. This is why some of the great saints, the Desert Fathers in particular, could look at themselves, and we would look at them and say, oh, these people are so holy. I can't even get close. And yet they would look at themselves and say, I'm a wretch. I'm a mess. I'm the worst of the worst. Because that's the way they saw themselves. They always knew that their sins had deeper implications, much deeper. And in the Christian life, it's the willingness to go into ourselves and to see ourselves as we really are. This is what Orthodoxy is trying to preserve for us. And the fact of the matter is, the deeper we see ourselves, the more we see ourselves, the more we get rid of the obstacles which keep us from seeing God and experiencing Him. Fourth, there's the first ecclesiastical use of anathema, which I mentioned. There are things we aren't supposed to do, and we cut ourselves off. The first writings against the Jewish misunderstanding of all of this. And lastly, the separation of Christianity from Judaism is beginning now. See, we wouldn't think ourselves as being Jewish anymore, and yet I've told you we are in a way, but we've also seen as something separate. And this led to the Romans persecuting the Christians in the first century and even in the second and third, because they saw them as being separate from Judaism, and there's a reason for that, and we'll look at that another time. The next time we'll look at the rest of the Pauline corpus from the years 57 to 64, and that will include the Epistle to Rome, the epistles to the Colossians, Ephesians, Philippians, and to Philemon, and also the Epistle of James, and the first and second Peter's epistles of St. Peter, what are known as the Catholic epistles, or part of the Catholic epistles, because they're written to the church at large. So, anyway, could go on for ages to ages. This is unto the ages of ages, world without end, right? Anyway, thank you.